Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to come to carbon pricing from another side, which is what's the ultimate objective that we are pushing for at this point in time, and within that, what role does carbon pricing play? And I'm going to build that very much around the work on sustainable infrastructure, the work of the new climate economy, which I've been privileged to be associated with. And the starting point, I would say, is that we now have a new global agenda, which, as we heard from Mr. Bock, is actually about growth. It's in fact about reigniting growth. It's about the 2030 development agenda, and it is about delivering on the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And at the heart of that really is sustainable infrastructure. Delivering on sustainable infrastructure is the path to get us there. And it is the growth story of the future. It provides the impetus right now to the global economy that is needed in a balanced way. It provides the innovation in a Schumpeterian sense for productivity and medium-term growth. And it's the only growth story on offer that is out there for the long term. And we saw that, I think, in the slide before. And it's a growth story that delivers not just on climate, it delivers on sustained growth, it delivers on cities where we can live and move and breathe, it delivers on ecosystems that are resilient, and it delivers on the quality of life for all, including the poor. And if you look at it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a unifying framework that have been adopted by world leaders, you will see that sustainable infrastructure actually relates to all of those goals in terms of inclusive growth, in terms of empowering and delivery of basic services, and in terms of environmental sustainability. And I think the central point to be recognized is that of urgency and scale. The next 10 to 20 years are really a moment in history. Why? Because the amount of infrastructure that we are going to put in place in the next 10 to 20 years is about or more than what we have on the planet today. So it is a great opportunity for us to make a great leap forward. It's also an opportunity for us to put ourselves in water, literally. So getting it right is going to be very important. And I think what is particularly important to recognize is that Paris, at one hand, set very high level of ambition, but on the other hand, it recognized that without ramping up ambitions, we are not going to deliver on the ambitions of Paris. And my colleague, Ottmar Edenhofer, made that evidently clear in the previous presentation. Now, together with this urgency comes opportunities, and there are several opportunities particularly that are important. The first is that we are living in a period where financially we enjoy relatively good conditions, especially relatively low interest rates to finance long-term infrastructure. We also enjoy great technological advances, as we have heard through the course of the day, and we have the opportunity to shape an infrastructure that doesn't exist even today. Most of this infrastructure will be in emerging markets and developing countries, and these countries have great opportunities to leapfrog and avoid the mistakes of the past. This is a graph that Ottmar had talked about, so I will skip it, but I want to talk about the composition of infrastructure spending. And this came through even in the morning's presentation. When you look at the total amount of infrastructure that needs to be invested in, It's not that different in total amounts, but there are two things that are extremely important in terms of composition. First, we need to invest a lot more on energy efficiency. And second, we need to make a major shift from conventional infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure. And that means, by the way, not just renewables, but changing the trajectory of all infrastructure. Second point I think is very important to point out is there's tremendous disparity in the levels of energy consumption. And you can see that in terms of the magnitudes of consumption across countries and regions. And as was pointed out again this morning and pointed out by Otmar, the consumption levels, indeed the access to energy, is a major discrepancy in the system. Also, as was pointed out, technology is a great advantage to us today, not only in terms of falling costs, in terms of the generation, but also in the possibilities of storage. And together, falling costs for energy production and greater opportunities for energy storage is a transformative moment together. Despite these opportunities, though, I think it is fair to say that we are falling short in two respects. First, too much of the infrastructure that exists today is aging, inefficient, and polluting, and we are not replacing it as fast as we should. And that's mainly a challenge in advanced economies, but it's also a challenge in many emerging markets, notably China and India. Second, too much of the infrastructure, the new infrastructure that is being built, is still old infrastructure in the sense it is based on suboptimal technologies that will last for a long, long time. So we need to change the game. And when you think about changing the game, there are four reinforcing elements that come together in changing the game. The first and very centrally is carbon pricing. At the moment, we are in a territory of negative prices because of subsidies. So we have to move from negative prices even before we talk about a price for carbon. So elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and then getting to a positive price for carbon is the first element of the platform. The second one is that despite the fact that price of carbon is very important, a lot, indeed, a majority of investment decisions are still determined by public policy. So public policy can have a very important element in changing direction through investment planning and government procurement and indeed setting the direction. Third, finance can be a very powerful way of driving and enabling change. And finally, we need to do a better job in terms of concerted support of technology. So it's important to see carbon pricing as one element of a combined package of policies. Second, and speaking for emerging markets and developing countries, it's important to recognize that we cannot have a uniform approach to carbon pricing, but we can't have an extremely discordant approach, otherwise there won't be a level playing field. So what are the arguments for differentiation? One argument is very clearly that emission reduction targets may not be as stringent in low-income countries or lower-income countries as they should be in advanced countries. Second, for a given price, you might have more emission reduction in an emerging market than you might in an advanced country because of in some sense, the elasticities of demand may be quite different. Third, as was pointed out, the distributional impacts of carbon pricing have to be taken into account. In theory, you can compensate by having transfers, but in practice, that may be very difficult. However, there are two other arguments on the other side that suggest that carbon pricing may actually be relatively favorable in poor countries. The first is that there are very important co-benefits, especially in terms of pollution, which has a tremendously deleterious effect on the poor. And the second is, as we heard, carbon prices generate revenues that can be used for health, education, things like sustainable infrastructure. All in all, we know that carbon pricing has to be somewhat differentiated, but at the same time, we need to have some clarity going forward so that we don't create, in some sense, a playing field that is damaging for business and for countries. I want to spend 1 minute on another aspect of complementary policy that has just come into force, and that is climate-related financial disclosure. Why is it closely related? Because it is also a powerful incentive. If you have full disclosure of risks and exposure, both in terms of physical risks and as well as in terms of policy, it will not only provide stability to the financial system, but it will be a very important incentive for businesses to change practices and to move to a low-carbon transition. The FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has come out with its recommendations. The G20 considered them at finance ministers' level in Baden-Baden just past weekend. And moving forward with those recommendations, getting them traction will be a very important part of the arsenal. The Global Commission on the Economy and the Climate, in my view, has correctly pressed that we should not just leave it at a voluntary level, but we should push for mandatory use ultimately of this disclosure, again, to create a level playing field. I want to turn and close with the issue of finance. So there's plenty of savings in the world right now, but the problem is that we are not able to turn, in some sense, investment opportunities into real demand, and we are not able to mobilize the financing that we need to meet those financing demands. I also want to stress that the cost of capital is something that we often ignore. If you look at the cost of capital and the difference in cost of capital between advanced countries and emerging markets, it often tilts the balance against more sustainable investments. In this graph, you will see that if you compare, for example, gas to wind in an advanced economy, it's about the same. But with the costs of financing, it becomes much less attractive to go for the renewable option in emerging markets and developing countries. To close, let me just make one point. We talk about climate finance, we talk about mobilizing private finance. Ultimately, the scale of investment we are looking at is in the trillions, as we have heard, and the challenge is how do we move from the billions to the trillions. And one very powerful instrument in that, which we haven't talked about today, is the role of multilateral development banks. They play a key role in the upfront reforms that are needed to make projects viable and sustainable. They play a key role in de-risking, and they play a key role in bringing together the parties that ultimately constitute what we would call viable, sustainable projects. At the moment, multilateral development banks in aggregate lend about 70 billion in total, about 50 billion for sustainable infrastructure. The total needs for sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets and developing countries are in the order of about 2 trillion right now, rising to 3 to 4 trillion in the period I'm talking about. So to catalyze the kind of private financing that we need to put the multilateral development banks in a very, very different footing than they are today. And that has to be also part of the equation. So coming back, carbon pricing is a central foundation. If it is wrong, we can't build the other pillars, but it's not the only foundation to get to the objectives that we are, and it's extremely important that we have this debate and discussion to look at this as part of a package that is adapted and that moves us to a scale and at a pace that is much faster than we are and we have been at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.